Manager decides to fire one of the company's best employees for missing work to attend their own wedding, but then something happens that makes them regret it. Stephen was known as an exemplary employee, always dedicated and committed to everything he did. Since he joined the company years ago, he had demonstrated an impeccable work ethic, earning the respect of his colleagues and superiors. Always willing to collaborate and solve problems, he became one of the pillars of the team, admired for his responsibility and for never sparing any effort to deliver the best results. Outside of the professional environment, Stephen had a personal life that was equally organized and happy. For years, he had maintained a solid relationship with Deborah, a woman who brought balance and joy to his life. After many shared moments, they decided to get married, and Stephen, for the first time in years of dedication, requested a day off to celebrate this special event. On the long-awaited day, surrounded by friends and family, he experienced one of the happiest moments of his life, believing that he had reached the peak of personal and professional fulfillment. The day after the wedding, Stephen woke up early. Deborah was still asleep beside him, her face calm, as if she had just lived one of the happiest days of her life. He carefully got up so as not to wake her and went straight to the kitchen. He prepared a simple breakfast. As he arranged the table, he heard Deborah's soft footsteps. She entered the kitchen with a light smile, her hair still messy, and greeted him. "Good morning, husband," she said playfully as she approached. "Good morning, wife," Stephen replied, smiling, before receiving a loving kiss from Deborah. They sat at the table and began to chat. Deborah looked at him, still laughing, and said, "It doesn't even feel like we got married yesterday. Are you really going to leave me to go to work? Don't you want to take the day to rest?" Stephen let out a short laugh and replied, "I know it feels strange, but I can't just drop everything. I promised myself I would come back today. One day off is more than enough." Deborah shook her head, still laughing. "Only you. Well, good luck at work, but don't forget, I'm your boss now, too." They both laughed, and after finishing breakfast, Stephen grabbed his briefcase and kissed her again. "I'll see you later. Take care of everything here, okay?" "Don't worry. Good luck, my love," Deborah replied before watching him leave. Stephen walked to work with light steps, still immersed in the happiness of the previous day. When he arrived at the company, he greeted a few colleagues and headed to the reception. Stephanie, the receptionist, lifted her eyes from her desk as soon as she saw him and broke into a warm smile. "Good morning, Stephen, and congratulations on the wedding," Stephanie said, excited. "How was the big day? I bet it was amazing." Stephen returned the smile and replied, "Good morning, Stephanie. It was wonderful, thank you. It was everything we dreamed of and more." She nodded but soon frowned, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and surprise. "But what are you doing here?" He raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I came to work, of course. It's my first day back after the wedding." Stephanie blinked a few times, as if struggling to believe what he had just said. "Work? But didn't you get fired?" Stephen's relaxed expression vanished instantly, replaced by a look of disbelief. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of Stephanie's words. "Fired? What are you talking about? I wasn't fired. I just took a day off for my wedding and I informed everyone in advance." Stephanie looked uncomfortable but tried to explain. "Yesterday, Mark announced that you were fired because you missed an extremely important day for the company. He said it was unacceptable." For a moment, Stephen stood completely still. His mind raced to find a logical explanation, but everything seemed absurd. "He said that?" he asked, his voice thick. "That doesn't make sense. I gave notice. I spoke to him personally, Stephanie." She looked at him with compassion. "I know, Stephen. It must have been some misunderstanding. Why don't you go talk to him? Maybe he can clear everything up." Stephen took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, though he felt his stomach churn. "You're right. I'll talk to him right now." With firm steps, but his heart racing, Stephen walked to Mark's office. He stopped in front of the door for a few seconds, trying to prepare himself for the conversation he was about to have. Finally, he knocked on the door. "Come in." Mark's voice echoed from inside, cold and impersonal. Stephen opened the door and entered the room. Mark was sitting at his desk, engrossed in papers and reports. He quickly looked up, his expression remaining neutral as he recognized Stephen. "Ah, Stephen," Mark said, reclining in his chair with calculated calm. "What brings you here today?" Stephen closed the door behind him and stood, trying to control the anger and confusion bubbling inside him. "Mark, I just got here and I found out from Stephanie that I've been fired. I want to understand what's going on. Is that true?" Mark sighed as if the conversation was an inconvenience. He adjusted his tie before responding. "Yes, Stephen, it's true. Your termination was communicated yesterday. I thought you were already aware of that." Stephen frowned, disbelief etched on his face. "But how is that possible? I only took a day off for my wedding. 1 day, Mark, and I informed you weeks in advance." Mark tilted his head, studying Stephen for a moment, before responding in an almost didactic tone. "You did notify me, Stephen. I won't deny that. However, notifying doesn't change the impact of your absence. Yesterday was an extremely important day for the company. We had a strategic client here, the most significant project presentation of the quarter, and I had to reorganize the entire team because you, someone crucial to the team, decided not to show up." Stephen stepped forward, feeling his face heat up. "I didn't decide not to show up, Mark. I got married. I gave notice that I wouldn't be here that day, and you agreed." Mark raised a hand, interrupting him. "I agreed to your day off, yes, because at that moment I thought we could adjust things without you. However, in practice, your absence caused a severe impact. The data you were supposed to present was incomplete. Your team was overloaded, and the client left unsatisfied. It was an unacceptable situation." Stephen shook his head, his voice trembling. "You're blaming me for something that wasn't in my control? I did my work. I delivered everything I could before the day. If there were failures, it wasn't because of me." Mark watched him with the calm of someone who had already made up their mind. "Maybe, Stephen, but the problem is that in the end, the responsibility falls on the person who's absent. That's how the world works. You weren't here, and that cost the company dearly. As a manager, my job is to make sure everyone is aligned with the business priorities. Yesterday, you showed that your priority wasn't the work." Stephen threw his hands up, incredulous. "I showed that my priority wasn't the work. It was my wedding, Mark, one of the most important days of my life. Don't you understand that?" Mark remained impassive. "I understand that it was an important day for you, Stephen, but what you seem to not understand is that every decision has consequences. Yesterday was the day to ensure the success of the presentation, to solidify a relationship with a client who can define the future of the company. You chose not to be present, and that was an unacceptable failure in my view." Stephen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his manager's words. "I've dedicated years to this company. I've always been here. I've always done more than expected. And now you're telling me that one single day, for a legitimate reason, erases all of that?" Mark crossed his arms and responded coldly. "I'm not saying your past efforts haven't been noticed, Stephen. The problem is that in the business world, results are what matter. Your absence cost us a result we needed. I'm sorry, but the decision has been made." Stephen stood in silence for a few seconds, looking directly into Mark's eyes. He tried to find some compassion, some spark of humanity there, but he found only indifference. "Do you really think this is fair?" Stephen asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. Mark shrugged, the gesture relentlessly casual. "I believe it's necessary. I hope you see this as a lesson, Stephen. Priorities need to be clear, always." Stephen clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to continue arguing, but he knew it would be futile. Mark wasn't going to change his mind. He shook his head and stepped toward the door. "Thanks, Mark. This conversation has made one thing very clear to me. Working here was never about respect or recognition. It was just about numbers." He opened the door and left, leaving Mark sitting with the same cold expression. As Stephen walked through the office, he felt the weight of everything that had just happened. A few colleagues tried to approach, but he simply gave a brief wave, said goodbye to a few closer ones, and left the building, knowing that this place was no longer for him. Stephen arrived home, walking slowly to the door. He opened it carefully, trying to avoid Deborah noticing immediately the weight he was carrying. As soon as he entered, he found her sitting in the living room reading a book. She looked up and smiled, but the smile quickly disappeared when she noticed Stephen's downtrodden expression. "You're already back?" Deborah asked, standing up. "What happened? Why did you come back so early?" Stephen sighed deeply and took off his shoes before replying, trying to find the right words. "I got fired, Deborah." She widened her eyes in disbelief. "Fired? How is that possible, Stephen? This doesn't make sense. Why?" Stephen sat down on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees and rubbing his face. "Mark said it was because I missed yesterday. He said it was a crucial day for the company and that my absence was unacceptable." Deborah blinked a few times, trying to process. "Is this for real? He knew you were getting married. You gave him notice weeks in advance. How can he justify something like this?" "He tried to justify it," Stephen replied with bitterness. "He said yesterday was the day for an important presentation to a client and that my absence cost the company dearly. He basically put all the blame on me for something that wasn't even under my control." Deborah crossed her arms with an expression of disbelief. "You're kidding me, right? This is unbelievable." Stephen shook his head. "I wish it were a joke, Deborah, but it's not. I tried to argue, explain that I gave notice, that it was a legitimate reason, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was a matter of priorities and that I made the wrong choice." Deborah stood silent for a few moments, looking at Stephen with a mix of anger and frustration. Finally she spoke, her voice firm. "This is unacceptable. You had every right to take a day for your wedding. He can't treat you like this, like you're disposable." Stephen sighed and looked down at the floor. "Maybe he can. Maybe that's what companies like this do, Deborah, but thinking about it, maybe this isn't such a bad thing." She furrowed her brow, surprised. "Not such a bad thing? What do you mean, Stephen?" Stephen shrugged, still with a sad look. "I've spent years dedicating myself to that company, putting up with Mark and his selfish attitudes. If this hadn't happened, I would probably have stayed there for more years, wearing myself out, without ever being truly valued. Maybe it's better this way." Deborah furrowed her brow, surprised. "Maybe you're right. Still, that doesn't make what happened right, but what matters now is that we're together. We'll get through this, Stephen." He smiled slightly, grateful for the support, and hugged Deborah. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." Meanwhile, at the company, an unusual visit was taking place. Paul, the company president, had just arrived. He was known as a respected figure, but rarely seen in the company hallways, appearing only when there were important matters to address. His direct and impartial style made him a leader admired, but also feared by those who did not adhere to the values he upheld. Paul passed by the reception, greeting employees with a restrained smile and brief waves. He made a point of remembering faces, which reinforced his respect for the team. Without wasting any time, Paul went straight to Stephen's desk, as he had a specific matter to discuss with him. When he arrived, he frowned upon noticing that the desk was empty, with none of the personal items that were usually there. He looked around and called one of the nearby employees. "Where is Stephen?" Paul asked, his voice firm and curious. The employee, caught by surprise, hesitated before answering. "Mr. Paul, I think he..." Was fired. Fired? Paul repeated, incredulous. Are you sure about that? Stephen fired? This doesn't make sense. The employee swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. That's what we were told yesterday. Paul said nothing more and turned on his heel, walking firmly toward Mark's office. His expression was a mix of perplexity and irritation as he processed the information. He opened Mark's office door without knocking, entering with determination. Mark quickly lifted his eyes from his paperwork, clearly surprised. He straightened up in his chair, forcing a smile when he recognized the company president. Mr. Paul, what an honor to have you here. I didn't know you'd be coming today. Paul ignored Mark's attempt to sound friendly and went straight to the point. Mark, I came here today exclusively to speak with Stephen. I wanted to congratulate him on the great work with a recent client. But to my surprise, I didn't find him at his desk. I was told he was fired. Is this true? Mark's smile disappeared instantly. He adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable, and responded carefully. Oh, yes, about that. Yes, Stephen was fired yesterday. It was a necessary decision, Paul. Paul narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms. Necessary? Explain yourself, Mark. What could possibly justify firing one of the most dedicated employees in this company? Mark cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. Well, Stephen was absent yesterday, and it was a crucial day for us. We had the most important project presentation of the quarter for a strategic client, and his absence caused major issues. I had to reorganize the team at the last minute, and the client left unsatisfied. Given the negative impact, I thought it was the most appropriate decision. Paul leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. You knew he was going to be absent, didn't you? He informed me weeks ago that he would take one day off for his wedding. That's what he did. And you're telling me that because he exercised a basic and legitimate right, you thought it was fair to fire him? Mark tried to defend his position, but his voice trembled. Sir, I understand his point of view, but the truth is, his absence complicated things a lot. I was thinking about the company's best interest. The company's best interest? Paul interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. You think losing one of our best employees is in the best interest of the company? What kind of reasoning is that, Mark? Sir, look, Mark tried to argue, but Paul silenced him again. I don't want to hear any more excuses, Mark. Let me make something very clear. Stephen is one of the most valuable employees we have. He dedicated years to this company, delivering results above expectations, while putting up with your selfish attitudes. And now you fire him for taking one day off, which he informed you about in advance, for his wedding? This is unacceptable. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Paul interrupted him again, his voice rising. You have no idea what it means to lead, Mark. Leadership is not about using your position to punish people who exercise their rights. It's about valuing your team, recognizing the efforts of those who make this company grow, and you've failed miserably at that. Mark was visibly pale, sweating as he tried to justify himself. Sir, I thought it was best to keep the team in line. Keeping the team in line? Paul almost shouted, his voice echoing in the room. You put your ego above respect and recognition. And now tell me, how are you going to explain to the client that the employee responsible for delivering brilliant results was fired for something so petty? Did you even think about that? Mark lowered his eyes, completely cornered. I didn't consider that. Of course not, Paul said harshly. He straightened up, adjusting his suit jacket. I'll fix this myself. I'm going to Stephen's house, apologize in person, and try to convince him to come back. And Mark, let me be very clear, if he doesn't accept, the consequences for you will be severe. And when I say severe, I mean you'll be looking for a new job by the end of the week. Paul turned and left the room without waiting for a response, leaving Mark sitting, pale and almost trembling. After leaving Mark's office, Paul headed for the parking lot, got into his car, and started driving towards Stephen's house. The anger he felt at Mark's actions mixed with a sense of responsibility. He knew he needed to resolve this situation, not only for Stephen, but also for the example it would set for the company. Within minutes, he arrived at the address. He parked on the street and, after adjusting his suit, walked up to the door. He knocked firmly. After a few moments, the door opened and Stephen appeared, surprised to see the company president at his doorstep. "Mr. Paul," Stephen said, blinking, as if confirming that it was really him. "Hello, Stephen. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I need to talk to you. Can we have a few minutes?" Paul said with a respectful but firm tone. Stephen hesitated briefly, but opened the door for him to come in. "Of course, Mr. Paul. Please, come in. We can sit in the living room." The two walked into the living room, where Deborah also appeared, curious. Stephen made a brief introduction. "Deborah, this is Mr. Paul, the company president." "Nice to meet you," Deborah said, before retreating to give privacy to the conversation. Paul sat on the couch while Stephen sat across from him in the armchair. Paul took a deep breath before speaking. "Stephen, I'm here for a very serious reason. I want to apologize for what happened. I heard about your firing, and I want to say that it was a monumental mistake. I came here to fix this." Stephen leaned slightly forward, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Paul, I appreciate you coming here, but honestly, I don't see how this can be fixed." Paul raised his hand as if asking for patience. "Stephen, I understand how you feel. What Mark did was unacceptable. He made a completely inappropriate decision without considering your history or the respect you deserve. I want you to know that this does not reflect the values I expect from leadership in this company." Stephen sighed, crossing his arms. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Paul, but that doesn't change the fact that I was treated as if all the years I dedicated to the company meant nothing. It was humiliating." Paul nodded, his expression serious. "And that's exactly why I'm here. I want you back, Stephen. Not just in the same role, but in a higher position with a higher salary. You deserve more recognition, and I want to make sure you never face something like this again." Stephen shook his head with a sad smile. "I understand the gesture, Mr. Paul, but it's not about the position or money. It's about respect. Mark never respected me or many of the other employees. This was just the peak of a series of problems that probably never reached your knowledge." Paul frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Stephen leaned his elbows on his knees, his voice filled with frustration. "Mark has always been a problem. He created a toxic environment, made bad decisions, and never valued anyone but himself. For a long time, I thought my dedication would make a difference, but now I see that, to him, I was just another number." Paul tried to intervene. "Stephen, I know it seems that way, but it's not. The company values you. I value you." Stephen looked directly at him with firmness. "With all due respect, Mr. Paul, if you valued me, it's too little, too late. I've made my decision. I can't go back to a place where I was treated this way. It wouldn't be fair to myself." Paul remained silent for a few moments, studying the determined look on Stephen's face. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "I understand. I can't say I agree, but I respect your decision. I just hope that someday you'll consider giving us another chance. Until then, I wish you and Deborah all the happiness and success in the world." Stephen thanked him, shaking his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Paul. I wish you the same." They shook hands, and Paul stood up to leave. Deborah briefly appeared to say goodbye, and within a few minutes, Paul was back in his car with a different expression. There was contained anger, not at Stephen, but at Mark. When he arrived at the company, Paul didn't waste any time. He walked straight to Mark's office, opened the door without knocking, and closed it behind him. Mark quickly stood up, alarmed by Paul's expression. "Mr. Paul, what happened? Did you get to speak with Stephen?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual. Paul walked up to the desk, his voice firm and relentless. I spoke to him, yes. And do you know what he told me, Mark? He said he's not coming back because you, with your arrogance and lack of vision, destroyed any trust he had in this company. Mark raised his hands in a defensive gesture. Paul, I've already explained it was a decision based on the situation. The client was dissatisfied and... Enough, Paul interrupted, his voice echoing in the room. I don't want to hear any more. Your incompetence not only cost us one of the best employees we've ever had, but also revealed something even worse. You should never have held this position. Paul, please, Mark tried to speak, but Paul cut him off again. Silence, Paul shouted. I tried to fix your mistake, but the damage has already been done. You're not fit to lead. You're fired, Mark. You have until the end of the day to clean out your desk and leave this company. Mark tried to argue one more time. Paul, I can change. I can prove that. Enough, Paul said, unyielding. There's nothing to prove. I want someone who knows how to lead, who values people and has the respect of the team, and that's not you. Now get out of my sight. Paul turned and left the room, leaving Mark alone, pale and speechless. In the hallway, employees watched silently as Paul walked with firm steps, ready to start repairing the damage caused. The message was clear. In Paul's company, respect and recognition mattered more than any number or result, and for him, that was non-negotiable. As for Stephen, he decided to take the moment to reflect on his life and his priorities. Although the situation with the company had been painful, he felt a new sense of freedom. With Deborah by his side, he began to plan a future more aligned with his values, away from toxic environments where he could truly be valued. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he was certain that with dedication and mutual support, he and Deborah would find even brighter paths to walk together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.